close your eyes and picture a witch. You probably see a woman wearing a tall, pointed black hat, stirring a bubbling cauldron, with a black cat by her side and a broomstick leaning against the wall. This image is one of the most recognizable icons in human history, but almost everything you think you know about its origin is a lie. This is not the uniform of a dark sorceress who made a pact with the devil. For centuries, this was the professional attire of the most successful female entrepreneurs in the medieval world. These women were not casting spells. They were brewing beer. Long before the massive industrial breweries of today, beer was considered a food group, a vital source of nutrients, and a safer alternative to the often contaminated water of the Middle Ages. And for hundreds of years, the masters of this craft were women known as alewives or brewsters. They were the backbone of the village economy, the keepers of the community's health, and the pioneers of independent business. But as you will discover, their very success became their downfall. The pointed hat was never meant to be scary. In a crowded, chaotic medieval marketplace, an alewife needed a way to stand out so that thirsty customers could find her from across the square. The tall, conical hat was a beacon, a sign that said, "Here is where you can buy the best ale in town." The cauldron was not for brewing potions of toad skin and newt eyes. It was the essential tool of the trade, a massive copper or iron pot used to boil the wort, the sweet liquid extracted from grain. The broomstick was not for flying through the night. It was an ale stake, a traditional sign hung outside a house to notify neighbors that a fresh batch of brew was ready for sale. And the cat was not a magical familiar. It was a vital employee, a professional hunter kept to protect the precious stores of grain from the rats and mice that plagued medieval homes. So how did the image of a respected businesswoman become the face of ultimate evil? Why did history decide to take the tools of a female brewer and turn them into the symbols of witchcraft? To understand the erasure of the alewife, we have to travel back to a time when the hearth was the center of the world and beer was the lifeblood of Europe. We have to look at how these women built an empire from their kitchens, and why the rising powers of the church and the state decided that an independent woman with a boiling pot was a threat that had to be destroyed. This is not just a story about beer. It is a story about the birth of capitalism, the fear of female autonomy, and one of the most successful smear campaigns in the history of the world. Imagine walking down a narrow, muddy street in London or Munich in the year 1300. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat. You are tired, thirsty, and looking for a place to rest. You look up and see a tall black hat bobbing above the crowd. You follow it to a small stone cottage where a broom hangs over the door. Inside, a woman is tending to a massive steaming vat while a tabby cat naps on a sack of barley. She hands you a wooden flagon of thick, dark, nutritious ale. This woman is a brewster. She is a pillar of her community. She owns her own tools. She manages her own finances, and she answerable to no man. In a world where women had almost no legal rights, the alewife was the ultimate exception. She was powerful, she was wealthy, and she was everywhere. But the shadows were beginning to lengthen. The medieval world was changing, and the golden age of the brewster was about to come to a violent, orchestrated end. To understand the power of the medieval alewife, we must first understand the world she inhabited. Forget everything you know about beer as a luxury or a social lubricant used only for celebration. In the 11th and 12th centuries, beer was not just a drink. It was survival. It was liquid bread. It was the primary source of calories for the peasant, the knight, and the monk alike. In a time when the water from local streams was frequently tainted by animal waste, tanning runoff, or the lack of modern sanitation, beer provided a safe, sterile source of hydration. The boiling process required to make ale killed the pathogens that made raw water deadly. For the average person in medieval Europe, life without ale was not just difficult, it was unthinkable. At the heart of every medieval home was the hearth, and at the heart of the hearth was the woman of the house. In the rigid social structure of the time, the division of labor was clear. Men worked the fields, tended the livestock, and handled the heavy labor of the outdoors. The domestic sphere, however, belonged entirely to women. This included baking bread, preserving meat, spinning wool, and most importantly, brewing ale. Brewing was seen as a natural extension of cooking. Just as a woman was expected to provide bread for her family, she was expected to provide ale. It was a domestic duty, a chore as routine as sweeping the floor or tending the garden. But it was a chore that required an immense amount of skill, patience, and physical strength. The process began long before the fire was lit. A brewster had to be a master of biology and chemistry without even knowing those words existed. She had to understand the life cycle of grain. First came the malting. She would soak barley or oats in water until they began to sprout, then carefully dry them by the fire. This transformed the starches into sugars. If she let it sprout too long, the batch was ruined. If she dried it too fast, the flavor would be burnt. Once the malt was ready, she had to grind it into a coarse meal, mix it with hot water in her massive cauldron, and begin the mashing process. There were no thermometers in the year 1100. A brewster judged the temperature of the water by her touch, by the way the steam rose, or by the reflection of her own face in the liquid. She was looking for the sweet spot where the water was hot enough to extract the sugar, but not so hot that it killed the life within the grain. This liquid, known as wort, was then boiled. Since hops had not yet become the standard in England and much of Western Europe, women used a secret blend of herbs known as gruit. They would gather bog myrtle, yarrow, rosemary, and even henbane from the surrounding woods. These herbs provided bitterness to balance the sweetness of the malt, acted as a mild preservative, and often had medicinal or even mildly psychoactive properties. Every brewster had her own secret recipe, a signature flavor that was passed down from mother to daughter like a sacred heirloom. The final and most mysterious step was fermentation. In a world before the discovery of yeast, the transformation of sweet liquid into intoxicating ale was seen as a minor miracle. A brewster knew that if she used her old wooden stirring paddle or kept the vat in a certain warm corner of the kitchen, the magic would happen. They called it goddess good, a name that reflected their belief that the bubbling fermentation was a gift from the heavens. The amount of ale consumed was staggering. It is estimated that the average medieval adult drank between 1 and 2 gallons of ale every single day. This was not the high-alcohol craft beer we know today. Most of it was small beer, a low-alcohol, highly nutritious drink that provided the energy needed for back-breaking agricultural labor. Children drank it. The elderly drank it. Pregnant women drank it. It was the foundation of the medieval diet. Because ale spoiled quickly, usually within a few days, it had to be brewed constantly. This meant that every village was a hive of brewing activity. In every cottage, a woman was tending a fire, stirring a pot, and monitoring a fermenting vat. But something interesting began to happen. Because some women were simply better at brewing than others, neighbors began to ask if they could buy a gallon or two. A woman who had a surplus of grain or a particularly delicious recipe found herself with a valuable commodity. What started as a domestic chore for her own family slowly evolved into a small-scale commercial enterprise. This was the birth of the alewife as a businesswoman. She did not need a shop. She did not need a permit. She simply used the tools she already had in her kitchen to create a product that everyone in her community needed to survive. In these early centuries, the brewster was a respected figure. She was the provider of health and the facilitator of social life. When the brewing was done and the ale was ready, she would set up a bench outside her door and invite the neighbors over. These informal gatherings were the precursors to the English pub. In a society that was often dark, cold, and incredibly hard, the warmth of the alewife's hearth and the strength of her brew were the primary comforts of life. She was an essential pillar of the community, her status tied directly to her mastery of the cauldron. However, this domestic monopoly was built on a fragile foundation. As long as brewing remained a small-scale, low-profit household task, the men of the church and the state were content to leave it in the hands of women. But as the population grew and the demand for ale increased, the potential for profit grew with it. The kitchen was about to become a battlefield. The brewster, who had spent centuries perfecting her craft by the fire, was about to find herself in the crosshairs of an evolving economy that had no room for independent women. The transition from survival to profit would be the first step in the long, dark road toward the witch trials. As the clock of history moved into the 13th and 14th centuries, Europe was undergoing a massive transformation. Population centers were expanding, and the quiet rural villages were evolving into bustling market towns. With this growth came a surging demand for the most basic of human needs, and top of that list was ale. This is the era where we see the transition of the brewster from a simple housewife into a formidable commercial entrepreneur. The kitchen was no longer just a place for family meals, it was a production line. The hearth was no longer just a source of warmth, it was the engine of a small business. This was the rise of the brewster. To understand how a woman in the Middle Ages could start a business, we have to look at the unique legal and social loopholes of the time. While most women were legally tied to their husbands under the law of coverture, there were exceptions for those who traded in goods traditionally seen as domestic. Brewing was the perfect entry point. Because it was an extension of cooking, a woman could brew and sell her surplus without needing the formal permission of a guild or a heavy investment in a shop. She already owned the cauldron. She already had the fire. All she needed was a way to tell the world she was open for business. This is where we encounter the first of the great witch symbols that was actually a marketing tool, the ale stake. In a world where few people could read and write, visual branding was everything. When a brewster had finished a fresh batch of ale and it had reached its peak fermentation, she would take a long wooden pole and thrust it out of a window or fix it above her door. Often, she would tie a bunch of greenery or a bundle of twigs to the end. To a modern eye, this looks exactly like a broomstick leaning against a cottage, but to a medieval traveler, it was a welcome sign. It meant that inside this house, there was fresh, high-quality ale for sale. It was the golden arches of the 14th century. The ale stake was a symbol of authority and a guarantee of quality. If the ale was bad, the local ale conners, the medieval versions of health inspectors, would come and take the stake down or issue a fine. A woman with a tall, proud ale stake was a woman who was winning at the game of commerce. The scale of this industry was truly remarkable. In some English towns during the 1300s, nearly every third or fourth house was an unofficial alehouse. But it was not just a side hustle for extra pennies. For many women, especially widows and single women known as femmes, Souls Brewing offered a path to total financial independence. In a society where a woman could not own land or hold public office, a successful brewster could accumulate significant wealth. She could buy better quality grain in bulk. She could upgrade her equipment from small ceramic pots to massive copper vats that could hold 60 or 80 gallons. She could even hire other women to help with the heavy lifting of the malting and mashing processes. We see records of women in London and Norwich who were paying higher taxes than the master craftsmen of the city, all thanks to the strength of their brew. This economic power brought with it a level of social status that was dangerous in a patriarchal world. The successful alewife was a fixture of the local court records, not just as a defendant, but as a person of influence. She was a woman who navigated the complex world of grain prices and trade regulations. She had to be a shrewd negotiator because the cost of barley and oats fluctuated wildly with the seasons and the weather. She had to be a master of logistics, ensuring that she had enough fuel for the fire and enough clean water for the boil. And perhaps most importantly, she had to be a master of community relations. The ale house was the town square. It was where deals were made, news was shared, and tensions were lowered. The brewster was the curator of this space. She was part chemist, part accountant, and part diplomat. As these women became more successful, they began to innovate. They understood that branding mattered. Some would wear distinctive clothing, like the tall, pointed felt hats we mentioned earlier, to make themselves easily identifiable in a crowded market square. The hat was a crown of commerce. It told the world that she was a professional, a woman of means who was not to be trifled with. They also began to experiment with their recipes to cater to different tastes. Some brewed heavy dark ales for the winter months and lighter, quicker fermenting small beers for the harvest. They were responding to market trends centuries before the term was ever invented. But with success came the first whispers of resentment. To the men who were trying to organize the world into neat professional guilds, the independent brewster was a problem. She did not fit into their boxes. She did not serve an apprenticeship. She worked from home. Most importantly, she was keeping a large portion of the town's wealth in her own pockets. The very tools of her success, her bubbling cauldron, her protective cat, her marketing broomstick, and her distinctive hat, were starting to be viewed through a different lens. As the 14th century drew to a close, the atmosphere in the marketplace was shifting. The rise of the brewster had been spectacular, but the forces of the state, the church, and the emerging male-dominated capitalist system were starting to organize. They were looking at the massive profits being made in the ale industry, and they decided that the women who had built the industry from nothing were no longer welcome. The golden age of female brewing was about to meet the iron fist of regulation and the dark clouds of character assassination. In every flagon of ale sold by a successful brewster, there was a seed of her own destruction. Her independence was a challenge to the status quo. Her wealth was a target for those who wanted to control the flow of money. The stage was set for a struggle that would last for 200 years, a struggle that would eventually move from the marketplace to the courtroom, and finally to the stake. But for now, in the height of the Middle Ages, the brewster was queen. She stood by her fire, stirring her vat, confident in her skill and her place in the world. She did not know that her profession was about to be demonized and that her identity was about to be stolen by folklore. To truly understand the rise of the Brewster, we have to step inside her world and see the environment she created. The medieval alehouse was not a purpose-built tavern with a sign and a bar. It was a living room. It was a kitchen. It was the heart of the home opened up to the public. When an alewife hung her ale stake outside, she was inviting the world into her private sanctuary. Inside, the air would be thick with the scent of fermented grain and the steam from the latest boil. There were no individual tables, but long communal benches where a blacksmith might sit next to a traveling merchant or a local serf. This was the first truly democratic space in medieval society, and the Brewster was its architect. She managed the noise, the debts, and the personalities. She was the first woman in history to master the art of hospitality as a business. But with this public role came public scrutiny. The medieval authorities were obsessed with the quality and price of ale because it was a matter of public health. This led to the creation of one of the most fascinating professions in history, the ale conner. These were official inspectors appointed by the local manor or city council. Their job was to ensure that no brewster was cheating her customers by watering down the brew or charging more than the legal price set by the assize of bread and ale. The arrival of an ale conner at a woman's door was a moment of high tension. According to local lore, these men had a unique way of testing the sugar content of the ale. They would wear leather breeches and sit on a wooden bench where some of the fresh ale had been spilled. If after a few minutes they found it difficult to stand up because their pants were sticking to the bench, it was a sign that the ale was rich in malt and sugar. It was a pass. If they slid off easily, the brewster was in trouble. She faced heavy fines, or in extreme cases being paraded through the streets with her sour ale poured over her head. This constant pressure meant that successful brewsters had to be masters of quality control long before the invention of modern laboratories. The expansion of the business also led to a sophisticated tier system of products. An elite brewster did not just sell one type of ale. She understood market segmentation. At the top was the prime ale or double ale, a thick, potent, and expensive brew meant for festivals or wealthy travelers. Then there was the middle ale, the everyday drink of the working class. Finally, there was the small beer or third ale, made by running water through the grain one last time after the first batches were finished. This was sold for a fraction of a penny and was the primary hydration for children and the poor. By managing these different production lines from a single hearth, the alewife was demonstrating a complex understanding of profit margins and resource management. She was squeezing every possible cent of value out of a single sack of grain. Furthermore, the brewster was a vital link in the local supply chain. She was the primary customer for local farmers who grew barley and oats. She was the main employer for charcoal burners and woodcutters who provided the massive amounts of fuel needed to keep her cauldrons boiling for 12 hours at a time. Her success rippled through the entire village economy. When the brewster flourished, the village flourished. This interconnectedness gave her a hidden form of political power. While she could not vote or hold office, she could influence the local economy in ways that even the lords of the manor had to respect. She was an independent economic engine, and for a brief shining moment in the middle of the medieval era, she was untouchable. She had turned a domestic necessity into a commercial empire, and she had done it with nothing but a copper pot and her own iron will. Money in the Middle Ages was a rare and precious thing. For most people, life was a system of barter and labor exchange. You gave the lord of the manor a portion of your grain, and he gave you protection. You helped your neighbor harvest his field, and he helped you fix your roof. But for the alewife, the world worked differently. Because ale was a daily necessity, she was one of the few people in the village who saw actual coinage on a regular basis. Every pint sold for a farthing or a halfpenny was a drop of liquid wealth flowing directly into her purse. This constant stream of hard currency gave the Brewster a level of economic independence that was almost unheard of for women in the 14th century. She was not just a brewer, she was a capitalist in an era before capitalism had a name. To understand how radical this was, we have to look at the legal status of women at the time. Most married women lived under the shadow of coverture. This was a legal doctrine where a woman's legal identity was submerged into that of her husband. She could not own property, she could not sign contracts, and she could not sue in court. However, the world of trade required a different set of rules. To keep the economy moving, the law recognized a status known as femme sole. This allowed a woman to trade as a single person, even if she was married. The Brewster was the primary beneficiary of this loophole. In the eyes of the market, she was an independent agent. She could buy her own barley, she could lease her own equipment, and most importantly, she could keep her own profits. This financial autonomy was most visible among the widows of the medieval world. When a master brewer died, his wife often inherited the business through a custom known as free bench. This allowed her to keep her husband's land and tools as long as she remained unmarried. For many women, this was not a burden, but a liberation. Instead of looking for a second husband to provide for them, these widows realized they could provide for themselves. They became some of the most successful business owners in Europe. They had the experience, they had the customer base, and they had the capital. In city records from London to York, we find names of women who owned multiple properties and paid some of the highest taxes in their parishes. They were not just surviving, they were thriving. But the power of the alewife went beyond just holding coins. Because she was the keeper of the ale, she also became the keeper of the village ledger. In a time when currency was scarce, the alehouse ran on credit. A laborer might drink all week and promise to pay when he received his wages. A farmer might trade a sack of wool for a month's worth of small beer. The Brewster sat at the center of this web of debt. She was the informal banker of the community. She knew who was honest and who was a gambler. She knew whose harvest was failing and who had extra silver hidden under a floorboard. This gave her an incredible amount of social leverage. When the most powerful men in the village owed the local alewife money, the traditional hierarchy of the Middle Ages began to buckle. Imagine the tension this created. In the church, the priests preached that women were the weaker vessel and should be subject to their husbands. In the manor, the lords expected total obedience. But in the alehouse, the men were often in debt to a woman who was smarter, more organized, and more financially stable than they were. The Brewster did not need to ask for permission. She could decide which debts to call in and which to forgive. She could invest her surplus into buying more land or better livestock. She was a woman who could say no. And in a patriarchal society, a woman who can say no because she has a full purse is a dangerous thing. This independence also allowed Brewsters to form their own networks. While they were often excluded from the formal male guilds, they built informal alliances with other women. They shared resources, they lent each other equipment, and they protected each other's prices. They were creating a female-dominated economy within the larger male structure. This was the true source of the fear that would later fuel the witch hunts. It was not a fear of magic, but a fear of autonomy. The image of a woman standing alone by her fire with a ledger in her hand and a heavy purse at her belt was a direct challenge to the order of the world. As we move toward the end of the 14th century, we see the first signs of a backlash. The authorities began to realize that they could not control the alewife as long as she was economically independent. They started to introduce new taxes specifically targeting household brewing. They passed laws that required any woman selling ale to be officially licensed by a male official. They were trying to put the genie back in the bottle. They wanted the ale, but they wanted to strip away the power of the woman who made it. The battle for the soul of the brewing industry was becoming a battle for the control of female wealth. The alewife had built an empire of glass and grain, and the men who had watched from the sidelines were now ready to take it for themselves. The brewster was now a target. Her success was used as evidence of her greed. Her independence was framed as a rejection of godly order. Her wealth was something to be seized, and her influence was something to be crushed. The era of the independent female entrepreneur was reaching its peak, but the forces of the state were preparing to pull the rug out from under her. In the next chapter of her story, the coins in her purse would not be enough to protect her from the change that was coming with the introduction of a single new ingredient that would change the world of beer forever. Step out of the private hearth and into the light of the medieval town square. The marketplace was the internet of the Middle Ages. It was the place where information was traded alongside wool, grain, and livestock. It was a sensory explosion of shouting merchants, clattering carts, and the smell of roasting meat mixed with the stench of the open gutters. And in the center of this chaos, standing on her own 2 feet, was the alewife. By the 14th century, the business of beer had moved from the quiet cottage to the public stage. But the marketplace was not a place of freedom. It was a place of ironclad rules and constant surveillance. To sell ale in the medieval market was to enter a legal minefield. The crown and the local lords understood that, because everyone drank ale, whoever controlled the ale controlled the people. This led to the creation of the Assize of Bread and Ale, one of the first consumer protection laws in human history. This law dictated exactly how much grain should go into a gallon of beer, and exactly how much that gallon should cost based on the current price of barley. For a brewster, this meant that her profit margins were not hers to decide. They were fixed by men in far-off manor houses who had never stirred a cauldron in their lives. Every market day, the brewster had to transport her heavy wooden barrels from her home to her stall. Imagine the physical toll of this labor. These were not fragile women. They were muscular, experienced workers who handled heavy loads in the heat and the mud. Once her stall was set up, she was required by law to display her ale stake. This was no longer just a friendly suggestion to neighbors. It was a legal requirement. If you sold ale without a stake, you were an outlaw. The stake was a target for the ale conners, those official inspectors we mentioned, who would roam the market looking for a reason to issue a fine. This is where we begin to see the first cracks in the alewife's status. Court records from this period show a startling pattern. While both men and women brewed and sold ale, women were significantly more likely to be fined for breaking the assize. If a man sold sour ale, he might receive a warning. If an alewife did the same, she was often labeled a huckster, a term that started as a simple word for a retailer but quickly became a gendered slur. A huckster was seen as a woman who was naturally deceitful, someone who used her charms to trick honest men into buying bad brew. The seeds of character assassination were being sown in the very soil of the marketplace. The marketplace was also where the Brewster faced her first organized competition. As the profit potential of beer became obvious, wealthy men began to build permanent taverns and inns. These were large stone buildings that could hold hundreds of gallons and offer lodging to travelers. Unlike the alewife who worked from her home and sold her brew from a temporary stall, these tavern owners had the capital to bribe officials and influence local laws. They began to lobby the city councils to restrict the rights of home brewers. They argued that for the sake of public order and quality, only permanent establishments should be allowed to sell ale. It was a classic move to crush the small independent producer in favor of the large commercial interest. But the alewives did not go down without a fight. They used the marketplace to build their own alliances. We see evidence of women standing as witnesses for each other in court, defending the quality of each other's brew. They understood that their strength was in their numbers. In the crowded stalls of London and Paris, they shared market intelligence. Who was selling the best grain this week? Which ale conner was looking for a bribe? Which tavern owner was trying to steal their customers? This was a sophisticated network of female intelligence operating right under the noses of the authorities. However, the atmosphere of the market was changing. The church began to take a greater interest in the goings-on of the ale stalls. Preachers would stand on stone crosses in the square and rail against the sins of gluttony and intoxication. They specifically targeted the women who sold the drink. They called the alewives' house the gates of hell and claimed that a woman who spent her day in the company of drinking men was a woman who had lost her soul. They began to link the bubbling cauldron of the Brewster with the fires of damnation. In the medieval marketplace, every transaction was a performance. The Brewster had to be part actress, part warrior, and part diplomat. She had to smile at her customers while watching the ale conner out of the corner of her eye. She had to defend her prices against the complaints of the poor while paying her taxes to the agents of the rich. She was the most visible woman in the economy, and that visibility was becoming a liability. The very platform that had allowed her to rise to power was now being used to monitor her every move. The marketplace, which had once been her kingdom, was slowly being transformed into a trap. As the sun set on the market day and the stalls were packed away, the Brewster would return to her hearth. But she no longer felt as secure as she once did. The whispers of the preachers and the fines of the inspectors followed her home. The world was becoming more professional, more regulated, and more hostile to the idea of a woman with a full purse and an independent spirit. The battle of the marketplace was just the beginning. A new threat was about to emerge from across the sea, a small green flower that would provide the final excuse to take the brewing paddle out of the woman's hand forever. In the year 1347, a shadow fell over the ports of Sicily, and within months it had swallowed the heart of Europe. We know it as the Black Death, the Great Mortality. A plague so swift and so silent that it seemed like the very breath of God had turned to poison. Half of the population disappeared in less than 5 years. The marketplace fell silent. The fields were left to rot. The bells of the churches rang until there was no one left to pull the ropes. It was the end of the world as the medieval mind understood it. But for the alewives who survived the nightmare, the world that emerged from the ashes was unrecognizable and unexpectedly profitable. To understand why a global catastrophe led to a golden age for female brewers, we have to look at the cold, hard math of survival. Before the plague, Europe was overcrowded and wages were suppressed by a surplus of desperate labor. After the plague, the survivors found themselves in a world where labor was the most valuable commodity on Earth. With 50% of the workforce gone, Those who remained could demand double or triple their previous pay. For the first time in history, the common peasant had disposable income. They had silver in their pockets and a desperate desire to feel alive after living through an apocalypse. And the first thing they wanted to buy with that new wealth was high-quality ale. This created a sudden and massive shift in the brewing industry. Before the plague, most people drank small beer, the thin, watery byproduct of the brewing process. It was cheap, it was safe, but it was hardly a luxury. In the post-plague world, the demand for small beer plummeted. The working class now demanded the good stuff, the strong, thick, nutritious ale that had previously been reserved for the nobility. This was the moment the brewster became a titan. Because brewing was a domestic skill that could be scaled up quickly, the women who survived the plague were the only ones ready to meet this exploding demand. They were the ones with the vats, the knowledge, and the local connections. The years following 1350 saw an unprecedented rise in the status of the surviving alewives. As the price of grain fluctuated and the demand for labor surged, these women became the primary employers in their villages. They needed more wood for their fires, more help with the harvest, and more carters to move their barrels. The brewster was no longer just a neighbor selling surplus. She was a central hub in a rebuilding economy. We see records from this period of women buying up the properties of those who had died during the plague, expanding their kitchens into mini factories, and taking on apprentices. The financial gap between the brewster and her male counterparts was closing, and in many cases, she was pulling ahead. But this new wealth triggered a massive social panic. The ruling elite, the lords and the bishops, looked at the rising wages of the peasants and the growing independence of the alewives, and they saw a threat to the natural order. They believed that if a peasant drank strong ale and had silver in his purse, he would forget his place. In 1351, the English Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, an attempt to freeze wages and prices at pre-plague levels. It was a desperate move to strip the new wealth away from the working class, and the primary target of the price controls on the retail side was the alewife. The authorities began to use the law as a weapon of suppression. They argued that because grain was now more expensive and labor was scarce, any woman who raised the price of her ale was a war profiteer, a criminal who was exploiting the misery of the plague. The court rolls from the 1360s are filled with the names of women being fined for price gouging. But these fines were not just about money, they were about control. Every time an alewife was brought before a judge, she was being reminded that her economic power was a gift from the state, one that could be taken away at any moment. Despite the legal pressure, the alewives continued to flourish. The demand for their product was simply too high to be stopped by legislation. This led to a fascinating change in the architecture of the medieval home. We see the emergence of the formal alehouse room, a dedicated space within a private cottage, specifically for the commercial sale of drink. The brewster was professionalizing her environment. She was creating the first true public houses. She was also becoming a target for a new kind of social anxiety. As people moved from rural villages to the growing cities seeking higher wages, they brought their thirst with them. The urban alewife became a symbol of the dangerous allure of the city. She was independent, she was wealthy, and she was surrounded by a mobile, restless workforce. The Black Death had broken the old ties of feudalism. The brewster was the primary beneficiary of that breakage. She represented a new kind of person, an individual who built wealth through skill and trade rather than through land and bloodline. But the forces of the old world were not finished. They were watching the smoke rise from the brewster's chimneys, and they were calculating. They realized that they could not stop the demand for ale, but they could change who was allowed to profit from it. The next century would see the rise of a new kind of organization, the male-dominated professional guild, which would use the excuse of public health and order to declare war on the domestic brewster. The golden age born in the shadow of the plague was about to meet its greatest adversary. Imagine a brewster in the year 1370. She has survived the greatest disaster in history. She has buried her parents, her siblings, and perhaps her husband. She has taken her grief and turned it into an industry. She is wealthier than she ever dreamed possible. She stands in her doorway wearing her tall hat, looking out over a village that depends on her for its nutrition and its social life. She feels powerful. But in the halls of power, the men are already writing the laws that will label her a witch and a fraud. The plague had given her an opportunity, but the aftermath would create the conditions for her ultimate erasure. The light of her fire was about to attract the attention of those who would stop at nothing to put it out. As the 15th century dawned, the freedom that the alewives had enjoyed for generations began to wither. The informal world of the cottage hearth was being replaced by a new and formidable structure, the professional guild. In the great cities of Europe, from London to Paris and Bruges, the men who controlled the large-scale production of beer began to organize. They were no longer content to compete with the thousands of independent brewsters in the back streets. They wanted a monopoly. They wanted control. And they found their greatest weapon in the concept of professionalism. A guild was more than just a club for craftsmen. It was a powerful political and economic engine that had the ear of the king and the city council. The Worshipful Company of Brewers in London, founded in the early 1400s, was a prime example. On the surface, these guilds claimed they were protecting the public. They argued that only a guild member had the proper training, the proper equipment, and the proper oversight to produce safe, consistent ale. But if you look beneath the bureaucratic language, the true intent was clear: to create a market where women were legally prohibited from participating. The first wall they built was financial. The guilds introduced new regulations that required any commercial brewery to have a minimum amount of capital investment. They dictated the size of the vats, the number of employees, and the type of building required for production. These standards were intentionally set far beyond the reach of a woman working from her own kitchen. By redefining brewing as a heavy industry rather than a domestic craft, they effectively priced women out of the market. An alewife who had been selling high-quality brew for 20 years suddenly found herself labeled an amateur because she did not own a massive stone warehouse or a team of male laborers. The second wall was social and legal. To be a master of a guild, you had to serve a long apprenticeship, usually 7 years. But apprenticeship was a male-only path. A young girl could not be bound to a master brewer to learn the trade in the same way a boy could. This meant that even the most talented female brewers were barred from achieving the status of master. Without that title, they could not legally own a large-scale business or train their own staff. They were relegated to the status of servants or assistants in an industry they had once led. The guilds were systematically stripping away the right of women to own the means of production. We see the impact of this in the changing language of the court records. The term brewster, which had once carried the weight of a professional title, began to disappear from official documents, replaced by the more generic and less powerful alewife. In the eyes of the guild, a woman brewing at home was no longer a colleague, she was a nuisance. They began to lobby for laws that forbade women from selling ale at all unless they were the widows of guild members. And even then, these widows were closely monitored. They were forbidden from remarrying anyone who was not a member of the guild, and they were often prevented from taking on new apprentices. The goal was to ensure that even when a woman held power, she held it only as a temporary placeholder for a man. The guilds also used the power of taxation as a weapon. They worked with city officials to create a system where guild members paid a flat fee, while independent brewers were hit with per-barrel taxes that ate away at their already slim profit margins. For an alewife trying to support a family, the financial pressure became unbearable. One by one, the small home-based operations began to close their doors. The communal benches in the cottages went cold, and the ale stakes were taken down. The vibrant female-dominated social life of the local alehouse was being crushed under the weight of corporate regulation. This shift was not just about money. It was about a fundamental change in the way society viewed work. The medieval idea of the cottage industry, where home and business were one and the same, was being replaced by the early modern idea of the workplace. Work was now something that happened in a designated building away from the family, and it was something controlled by men. The Brewster who had managed her business while raising her children and tending her garden was now an anomaly. She was told that her place was in the home, but that her work in the home had no commercial value. The men of the guilds were also masters of propaganda. They began to spread rumors that home-brewed ale was unsanitary and prone to spoilage because women lacked the scientific understanding of the process. They portrayed the alewife as a chaotic figure, someone who ignored the weights and measures of the state in favor of her own whims. They positioned themselves as the rational, orderly alternative. They were the men of the law and the men of the science. The woman at the hearth was presented as a relic of a primitive past, a past that the new modern world needed to leave behind. By the middle of the 15th century, the trap was nearly shut. In the major cities, women were almost entirely excluded from the professional brewing trade. They were forced to the margins of society, selling small beer in the slums, or working as low-paid barmaids in the very taverns they used to own. The walls of the guild system had successfully enclosed the industry, turning beer into a commodity and the brewer into a man. But the independent spirit of the alewife was not entirely dead. In the rural areas, far from the reach of the city guilds, the Brewsters continued to stir their cauldrons. To defeat them, the authorities would need something more than just taxes and regulations. They would need a revolution in technology and a new kind of social terror that would turn the neighbors of the alewife against her. The introduction of the hop was about to provide the first, and the rising tide of the witch hunts was about to provide the second. For hundreds of years, the flavor of Europe was the flavor of Groot. As we have seen, the alewife was the master of this herbal mixture, using yarrow bog, myrtle, and rosemary to balance the sweetness of her malt. But Groot had a fatal flaw. It provided almost no preservative qualities. The ale produced by women in their kitchens was a living, fragile thing. It had to be consumed within days of being brewed before it turned sour and undrinkable. This physical reality dictated the entire structure of the industry. It kept brewing local. It kept it small. It kept it in the hands of the woman next door, because you could not transport ale over long distances. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, a tiny green flower began to arrive from the Netherlands and Germany that would shatter this domestic monopoly forever. This was the hop. The introduction of hops was the single most important technological shift in the history of alcohol. Hops are a natural preservative. When boiled with the wort, they released resins that inhibited the growth of bacteria. Suddenly beer for the first time. We must distinguish between unhopped ale and hopped beer could last for months instead of days. It could be stored in cellars. It could be loaded onto ships and sent across the sea. It could be transported by cart to distant cities. The hop transformed a perishable food item into a stable commercial commodity, and in doing so, it moved the power of production out of the kitchen and into the factory. For the alewife, the hop was a disaster disguised as progress. To brew with hops required a completely different scale of operation. Because hopped beer could be stored and sold over long periods, it encouraged the rise of large-scale industrial breweries. These facilities required massive copper vats, heavy-duty cooling systems, and huge warehouses for storage. The financial cost of setting up a hopped beer brewery was astronomical compared to the cost of a domestic ale hearth. Most alewives who operated on slim margins and recycled their household tools simply could not afford the entry price of this new technology. They were stuck in the past producing a product that was now seen as inferior and old-fashioned. The men of the guilds and the rising merchant class saw the hop as their golden ticket. They recognized that if they could control the supply of hops and the technology of hopped brewing, they could own the entire market. In London, the arrival of hopped beer from the continent was initially met with resistance. Traditionalists called it a wicked weed and claimed it would ruin the health of the nation, but the economic logic was undeniable. Hopped beer was more efficient to produce in bulk, it was more reliable for trade, and it was far more profitable. By the mid-1500s, the English authorities had flipped their stance. They began to pass laws that favored hopped beer production and placed heavy taxes on the traditional herbal ale made by women. This transition was accompanied by a deliberate campaign of misinformation. The male brewers and their allies in the church began to claim that traditional ale was dirty and prone to infection because it lacked the purifying qualities of the hop. They argued that the herbs used by alewives were not just flavoring agents, but dangerous substances. They started to link the use of Groot with folk medicine and by extension with witchcraft. The brewster, who had been the community healer and provider, was now framed as a peddler of spoiled, dangerous liquids. In contrast, the hopped beer produced by men in industrial settings was marketed as the clean, rational, and modern choice. It was the drink of the new era, while ale was the drink of the dark and superstitious past. The hop also changed the gender of the workforce. Because hopped brewing was an industrial process, it was moved out of the home and into the public sphere. In the medieval mind, the home was the woman's domain, but the factory was the man's domain. As brewing became a job that required heavy lifting, long-distance travel, and the management of large teams of laborers, it was redefined as male work. The brewster was told that the new technology was too complex and too physically demanding for her. She was pushed out of the brew house and relegated to the role of the consumer or the low-level server. The very word brewster, which specifically referred to a female brewer, began to fall into disuse, replaced by the masculine brewer. Furthermore, the hop revolution allowed for the creation of brand names and international trade. A brewery in Munich could now sell its beer in London. A merchant in Amsterdam could dominate the market in a dozen different ports. This level of globalization required legal contracts, credit systems, and international networks, all of which were closed to women. The alewife who relied on her personal reputation in her local village was invisible in this new world of global capital. She could not compete with the sheer volume and the lower prices of the industrial brewers. One by one, the small domestic ale houses were forced to close. The fire on the hearth went out, and the cauldron was sold for scrap or repurposed for laundry. By the time the hop had become the standard ingredient in European beer, the structural erasure of the woman brewer was almost complete. The technology had not just improved the drink, it had socialized the production in a way that intentionally excluded the people who had invented the craft. The hop was the catalyst for the first wave of industrial capitalism, and like many such revolutions, it was built on the displacement of female labor. But even with the technology in their hands, the men of the industry were still haunted by the legacy of the alewife. They needed a way to ensure she could never return to her position of power. They needed to take the tools she still possessed, her knowledge, her herbs, and her local influence, and turn them into something so terrifying that no one would ever dare buy a drink from a woman again. The technical revolution of the hop was about to be joined by the social terror of the witch hunts. The transition from Brewster to witch was no longer just an economic inevitability, it was becoming a legal and religious necessity. As the 16th century approached, the very nature of money was changing. The medieval world of local barter and small-scale trade was being swallowed by a new and aggressive force, early capitalism. For the alewife, this was the final economic nail in the coffin. Brewing was no longer just a way to feed a village or support a family. It had become an industry of mass production and global investment. And in this new game of high-stakes capital, the rules were written by men, for men. The transition from the kitchen hearth to the commercial brewery was not just a change in location, it was a total seizure of the means of production. The first major shift was the concentration of capital. In the old days, a brewster only needed a copper pot and a few sacks of grain to start her business. But as we saw with the introduction of hops and the rise of the guild system, the entry costs for brewing had skyrocketed. To compete in the new market, you needed massive warehouses, professional cooling systems, and a fleet of wagons for distribution. This required a level of investment that no individual woman could provide. While male merchants could form partnerships, pool their resources, and secure loans from the emerging banking houses, women were legally and socially barred from the world of finance. A woman could not sign a commercial contract in her own name or secure a loan without a male guarantor. By making the business of beer expensive, the system effectively made it male. This was further reinforced by the control of the supply chain. Early capitalists realized that if they owned the raw materials, they could control the final product. Wealthy male investors began to buy up the land where barley and hops were grown. They built massive granaries to store grain and manipulate the market prices. When grain was scarce, they would sell to the large male-owned breweries at a discount while charging the independent alewives the highest possible retail price. The brewster, who had once been the primary customer of the local farmer, now found herself at the mercy of middlemen and grain speculators. She was being squeezed at both ends, paying more for her ingredients, while being forced by the state to keep her prices low. Beer had also become a form of currency. In the growing cities of Europe, beer was used to pay the wages of laborers and to supply the massive armies of the rising nation-states. The scale of these contracts was enormous. A single brewery might be asked to provide thousands of barrels for a military campaign or a royal festival. These were the first government contracts, and they were awarded exclusively to the male masters of the brewers' guilds. The alewife, who brewed 20 gallons at a time, was invisible to the state. She could not participate in the massive transfer of wealth that was happening at the top of society. The industry was being divided into two worlds, a high-profit male-dominated industrial sector and a low-profit female-dominated domestic sector that was slowly being taxed out of existence. We also see the birth of the brand, and the death of the person. In the medieval village, you bought ale from Mary or Joan because you knew her and you trusted her skill. But in the capitalist market, you bought beer from a company or a guild brand. The personal reputation of the brewster, which had been her greatest asset, was now a liability. The market demanded consistency and volume over character and craft. The male-owned breweries marketed their products as standardized and reliable while painting home-brewed ale as unpredictable and amateurish. They were using the logic of efficiency to destroy the value of female labor. This economic exclusion was not an accident of history. It was a deliberate strategy to move wealth away from independent women and into the hands of the patriarchal state. The authorities realized that as long as women had their own source of income through brewing, they were harder to control. By industrializing the process and moving it into factories, they could ensure that women remained in the role of low-paid workers or unpaid housewives. The brewster who had once been a pillar of the village economy was now being told that her work had no place in the modern world. She was being redefined as a consumer rather than a producer. The rise of capitalism also changed the social space of the alehouse. The cozy domestic kitchen was replaced by the commercial tavern owned by a landlord and staffed by barmaids. The woman in the bar was no longer the owner or the master of the craft. She was an employee often hired for her appearance rather than her brewing skill. Her role was to serve the product that men had made and to ensure that the profits flowed back to the male owners. The transition was complete. The brewster had been stripped of her tools, her materials, her credit, and finally, her status. But even with the economy firmly in their grip, the new beer barons were not satisfied. They knew that as long as women still held the secret knowledge of brewing, there was a risk they might try to reclaim their industry. They needed a way to make the very act of a woman brewing beer seem not just unprofitable, but morally and spiritually dangerous. They had won the economic battle, but they were about to launch a psychological war. They were going to take the image of the independent woman at her cauldron and turn it into a nightmare that would haunt the imagination of the world for centuries. The logic of capitalism was about to be joined by the fury of the witch hunts. The destruction of the alewife was not just an economic event. It was a cultural assassination. To fully remove women from the brewing industry, the men in power realized they needed to do more than pass laws. They needed to change the way society saw the woman at the hearth. They needed to transform the brewster from a provider of life and community into a figure of filth, deceit, and moral decay. This was the birth of the smear campaign, a deliberate and highly effective wave of propaganda that used literature, poetry, and the church to poison the public imagination. At the center of this campaign was a new kind of storytelling. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, a genre of literature emerged that specifically targeted the female brewer. The most famous and most damaging example was a poem by the English poet laureate John Skelton titled The Tunning of Eleanor Rumming. In this brutal work, Skelton creates a grotesque caricature of a real-life alewife. He describes Eleanor as a woman who is physically repulsive with a face like a withered root and skin that is caked in grime. He claims she is so filthy that she brews her ale in a vat filled with chicken droppings, and that her customers are drunken hags who trade their wedding rings for a taste of her sour brew. This was not just bad poetry. It was a strategic weapon. By linking the alewife with physical ugliness and filth, Skelton was creating a psychological barrier between the woman and her craft. He was telling the public that a woman brewing at home was naturally unhygienic. He was contrasting the clean, professional, and male-dominated guild breweries with the chaotic and disgusting kitchen of the female brewer. The image of Eleanor Rumming became a viral sensation of the 16th century, spreading through woodcuts and street performances. It gave the public a visual shorthand for the female brewer as a figure of ridicule. But the propaganda went deeper than just physical appearance. It targeted the moral character of the alewife. The church began to preach that the alehouse was the porch of the devil, and that the woman who ran it was a temptress who led men into the sins of gluttony and lust. They coined the term ale-stake daughter to imply that any woman selling ale was effectively a prostitute. They claimed that the alewife used secret potions and charms to make men addicted to her brew. This was a direct attack on her skill. Her ability to create a delicious and popular product was no longer seen as a craft. It was seen as a form of manipulation or dark magic. The authorities also introduced the concept of the scold. A scold was defined as a woman who was loud, opinionated, and disruptive to the social order. Court records from this period show a massive increase in the number of brewsters being charged with being common scolds. If a woman argued with a tax collector or defended her prices in the marketplace, she was not seen as a businesswoman protecting her interests. She was seen as a woman who had forgotten her place. The punishment for being a scold was often the cucking stool or ducking stool, where the woman would be tied to a chair and plunged into a cold river or a pond in front of the entire village. This was a public ritual of humiliation, designed to strip the brewster of her dignity and her authority. We also see the emergence of the huckster trope in popular plays and woodcuts. The huckster was portrayed as a woman who cheated her customers by using false measures or watering down the beer. While men were also guilty of these practices, the propaganda focused almost exclusively on women. They were depicted as naturally deceptive, a direct callback to the biblical figure of Eve. By framing the alewife as a liar, the state could justify more intrusive regulations and more frequent fines. They were creating a narrative where the independent woman was a threat to the honesty of the marketplace. The very tools of the trade were being reinterpreted through this lens of suspicion. The tall black hat, which had once been a beacon of professional status, was now described as a sign of pride and vanity. The broomstick, which had marked the presence of fresh ale, was now linked in popular stories with the flight of witches. The bubbling cauldron, which had provided nutrition for centuries, was now a vessel for poison and dark rituals. The cat, which protected the grain, was now a demonic familiar. This was a total inversion of reality. Every symbol of the alewife's success was being turned into a symbol of her corruption. This smear campaign was incredibly successful because it played on the deep-seated fears of a changing society. As the old feudal world collapsed and the new capitalist world emerged, people were anxious and looking for someone to blame for their problems. The independent brewster was the perfect scapegoat. She was visible, she was often wealthy, and she operated outside the male power structures. By turning her into a monster, the state and the church could unite the public in a common cause. They could reclaim the brewing industry in the name of morality and order while lining their own pockets with the profits. By the middle of the 16th century, the transition in the public mind was complete. The brewster was no longer the respected neighbor who provided the community with its daily liquid bread. She was Eleanor Rumming. She was the common scold. She was the deceitful huckster. She was a figure to be mocked, feared, and ultimately destroyed. The fire on her hearth was no longer seen as a source of warmth, but as a spark of rebellion that had to be extinguished. The stage was now set for the final and most violent phase of the campaign. The words of the poets and the sermons of the priests had done their job. The public was ready for the trials. They were ready to see the woman at the cauldron not as a brewer, but as a witch. The propaganda against the alewife did not stop at poetry and plays. It entered the realm of the law and the supernatural. In the late 15th century, the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, provided the legal and theological framework for the persecution of independent women. This book argued that women were naturally more susceptible to the influence of the devil because of their supposed intellectual and moral weakness. It specifically pointed to the domestic activities of women like cooking and brewing as the perfect cover for demonic rituals. The cauldron, which for centuries had been a symbol of life-giving nutrition, was now described in these dark pages as a vessel for infanticide and poisonous concoctions. The smoke, rising from a brewster's chimney, which once signaled fresh ale for the village, was now interpreted by the paranoid as a signal to the underworld. As the image of the witch began to crystallize in the public mind, the very companions of the alewife were demonized. For hundreds of years, every brewster kept a cat. It was a practical necessity. Rats and mice were the enemies of the grain stores, and a good mouser was worth its weight in silver. But the propaganda turned this symbiotic relationship into something sinister. The cat was redefined as a small demon sent by the devil to assist the witch in her dark work. A woman seen talking to her cat while she stirred her vat was no longer a lonely business owner talking to a pet. She was a sorceress conferring with an imp. This was a stroke of genius by the propagandists because it turned an everyday domestic scene into evidence of a crime against God. For those women who dared to speak out against the rising taxes or the unfair guild regulations, the state introduced a horrific device known as the scold's bridle or the branks. This was an iron framework that was locked around a woman's head. It featured a metal bit that was inserted into the mouth and pressed down on the tongue, often with small spikes, to prevent the woman from speaking without causing herself agony. A brewster who was accused of being a common scold, or who argued too loudly in the marketplace, would be forced to wear this mask of silence while being led through the streets like an animal. This was not just physical torture. It was a symbolic erasure. It sent a message to every woman in the village that her voice had no value and that her independence was a disease that had to be cured through public humiliation. The smear campaign even reached the walls of the churches themselves in the form of doom paintings. These were large, vivid frescoes that depicted the horrors of hell to an illiterate congregation. In many of these paintings, you can find the figure of the alewife. She is often shown being dragged into the mouth of hell by demons while clutching her wooden ale flagon or her false measures. These images burned themselves into the retinas of the medieval peasants. Every Sunday they were told that the woman who sold them their drink was a companion of the damned. They were encouraged to view their local brewster with a mix of fear and contempt. The social bond that had sustained the village for 1,000 years was being dissolved by a constant drip of religious and artistic poison. This was character assassination on a global scale. The goal was to make the alewife feel like an outcast in her own community. If she was successful, she was accused of greed. If her ale went sour, she was accused of sabotage. If she lived alone, she was accused of unnatural behavior. By the time the formal witch trials began, the alewife had already been stripped of her humanity. She had been turned into a ghost, a caricature, and a monster. The men who wanted to control the brewing industry had successfully convinced the world that the only way to save the soul of the village was to destroy the woman who had built its economy. The transition from the business of beer to the business of burning was almost complete. The transition from the marketplace to the courtroom was a path paved with silver and blood. As the 16th and 17th centuries progressed, the smear campaigns we have explored reached their terrifying conclusion. The independent Brewster who had stood her ground against guilds and taxes now faced an enemy she could not bribe or outwork. The great witch craze was not a random eruption of religious mania. It was a targeted tool of social and economic cleansing. And at the heart of many accusations lay a dark and simple secret, the desire to erase a debt. To understand this, we have to look back at the village economy. As we discussed, the alewife was the informal banker of the community. Because everyone drank, and because currency was scarce, most ale was sold on credit. In every small town and parish across Europe, there were men who owed their local Brewster significant sums of money. These were not just peasants, but often local officials, merchants, and craftsmen. A running tab for a year's worth of ale could represent a massive financial burden for a medieval family. In a world with no formal bankruptcy laws, a debt to a Brewster was a permanent weight on a man's reputation and his future. But as the propaganda of the church and the state took hold, these debtors found a horrific way to clear their ledgers. If the woman you owed money to was convicted of witchcraft, her property was confiscated by the state, and her contracts were often declared void. An accusation of witchcraft was the ultimate debt cancellation policy. We see this pattern repeated with chilling frequency in the court records of Germany, Switzerland, and England. The women most likely to be accused were not the marginalized outcasts of popular myth. They were frequently older widows or single women who owned property, ran successful businesses, and held the debts of their neighbors. These were women with assets but without male protectors. By pointing a finger and whispering the word witch, a debtor could not only escape his financial obligations, but often stand in line to receive a portion of the woman's seized assets. The witch trials served as a final clearance for the male-dominated brewing industry. Historical analysis shows a startling correlation between the areas with the highest number of witch trials and the areas where the brewing industry was industrializing most rapidly. In cities where the male guilds were struggling to eliminate the last of the independent female brewers, the fires of the stake burned the brightest. It was a form of corporate hit job sanctioned by the church and the state. They did not need to compete with the Brewster's superior skill if they could convince the village that her skill was a gift from the devil. The cauldron, the most essential tool of her trade, became the primary evidence against her. It was no longer a vessel for life-giving nutrition, but a symbol of her pact with darkness. The psychological atmosphere of the time allowed this to happen with terrifying ease. After generations of smear campaigns, the public was primed to believe the worst. When a neighbor's cow died or a child fell ill, the first person to be blamed was the independent woman who lived alone and made a living by stirring a steaming pot. The Brewster was trapped in a logical circle of fire. If her ale was good, she was using magic to entice customers. If her ale went sour, she was using maleficium to sabotage her neighbors. Her success was proof of her greed, and her failure was proof of her malice. There was no escape. The trials themselves were designed to strip the Brewster of her identity. Under torture, women were forced to confess that their brewing herbs were actually ingredients for poisons. They were forced to admit that their protective cats were demonic familiars. The state was not just killing these women, they were erasing the history of their craft. They were transforming the memory of a successful businesswoman into the caricature of a monster. Every time a Brewster was executed, the male brewers moved in to take her market share. They took over her customers, they took over her supply chains, and they took over her reputation. Imagine the terror of a Brewster in 1600. She has spent her life building a business. She has navigated the complexities of hops and taxes and guilds. She is a master of her craft. And then she hears a knock at the door. It is the man she has known for 20 years, the neighbor who owes her 3 months of wages for the ale he has drunk. He is not there to pay his debt. He is there with the witch-finder. He claims he saw her flying on her ale stake. He claims he saw her cat speaking in tongues. Within days, she is in a cold cell, her business is destroyed, and her children are outcasts. This was the final violent stage of the erasure. It was the moment when the Brewster was officially and legally replaced by the witch. By the time the fires finally died down in the late 17th century, the transformation was complete. The independent female brewer had been hunted out of existence. The industry was now firmly in the hands of the male guilds and the rising industrial capitalists. The story of beer had been sanitized, and the women who had spent 1,000 years perfecting the art of the brew were relegated to the shadows of folklore. They were no longer the queens of the hearth. They were the hags of the woods. The debt had been settled, but the cost to history was immeasurable. To understand the systematic dismantling of the alewife, we must look past the folklore and into the archives. The history of the Middle Ages is not just written in the blood of battles or the stone of cathedrals, it is written in the ink of the court rolls. These documents, known as the petty sessions or the manor court records, provide a chillingly detailed account of the final days of the female brewer. They show us that the erasure of the Brewster was not a sudden event, but a slow, grinding process of legal harassment. These records are the receipts of a disappearing profession, and they tell a story of resistance as much as they tell a story of defeat. Imagine a small village court in England in the late 14th century. The air is cold and the room is filled with local men. On the table sits the court roll, a long strip of parchment where every fine and every accusation is meticulously recorded. One name appears over and over again: Alice the Brewster. In the year 1380, Alice was brought before the court 4 times. Her crime was always the same. She was accused of breaking the assize of bread and ale. She was fined for selling ale that the inspectors claimed was too thin and for charging a farthing more than the law allowed. But if you look closer at the records, a pattern emerges. Alice was not a bad brewer. She was a successful one. Each fine was effectively a tax on her success, a way for the local lord to take a cut of her profits without providing any support. These legal records reveal the birth of the gendered insult in the marketplace. In the earlier records, women are simply listed as Brewsters, a professional title. But as we move into the 15th century, the language changes. We start to see the word huckster used almost exclusively for women. In the city of Chester, the court records show a deliberate campaign to categorize all female retailers as hucksters. This was a legal trap. A professional brewer had rights and status, but a huckster was seen as a mere reseller, a person who added no value and was prone to deceit. By changing the label in the court rolls, the state was stripping the alewife of her professional identity. They were telling the world that she was not a creator of a product, but a parasite on the economy. One of the most revealing aspects of these records is the shift from fines to physical punishment. In the 13th century, if an alewife broke the law, she paid a few pennies and went back to work. It was a business expense. But by the 1500s, the punishments had become personal and humiliating. We find records of women being sentenced to the cucking stool for the crime of being a common scold while selling their ale. This was the law being used to break the spirit of the independent woman. A record from a village in Wiltshire describes a woman named Marjorie who was fined not just for the quality of her beer, but for her prideful speech in the face of the inspectors. The court was no longer just regulating a drink, it was regulating the behavior and the personality of the woman who made it. The archives also contain the heart-wrenching stories of widows trying to protect their inheritance. In the City of London, the records of the Brewers Guild show a series of legal battles where widows of master brewers fought to keep their right to brew. These women often had decades of experience and had managed the business alongside their husbands for years. But the new guild regulations were designed to force them out. We find transcripts of women arguing that they have the skill and the equipment to continue, but the judges ruled that a woman could not hold authority over male apprentices. The law was effectively saying that a woman's knowledge was worthless if it was not under the control of a man. These records show us the exact moment when thousands of years of female craft were legally stolen. However, the records also show moments of incredible defiance. In some towns, women formed their own unofficial legal networks. We find cases where groups of alewives were fined together for refusing to lower their prices in the face of unfair grain taxes. They were effectively conducting the first strikes in history. They stood together in the village square and told the court that they would not brew at a loss. These records show that the brewster was not a passive victim. She was a political actor who understood her value and was willing to face the cucking stool or the jail cell to defend it. As we move into the 17th century, the court records take a darker turn. The charges of price gouging and bad quality begin to merge with the charges of witchcraft. In the records of the Essex witch trials, we find women whose primary crime was their involvement in the ale trade. One woman was accused of causing a neighbor's cow to fall ill, but the background of the case shows a long-running dispute over a debt for a barrel of ale. The law was the bridge that allowed an economic grievance to become a supernatural capital crime. The petty sessions were the training ground for the witch-finders. They learned who the independent women were, who held the most debt, and who was most vulnerable to an accusation. By the end of the 17th century, the brewster has almost entirely vanished from the legal records as a business owner. Instead, she appears as a pauper, as a barmaid, or as a criminal. The ink of the court rolls has done its job. The law has transformed the queen of the hearth into a ghost of the past. These records are more than just dusty papers, they are the autopsy of a murdered profession. They provide the undeniable proof that the end of the female brewer was not an accident of history, but a cold, calculated legal execution. When we look at these names, Alice, Marjorie, Joan, we are looking at the women who built the foundation of the modern world, only to be erased from its memory by the very laws they helped to fund with their labor. By the 18th century, the fire on the independent hearth had been extinguished. The brewster, the master of the cauldron, and the architect of the village economy was a ghost. In her place stood a new figure designed by the male-dominated brewing industry, the barmaid. This was not a simple change of title. It was a total demotion of the female spirit. The woman in the public house was no longer the owner, the chemist, or the entrepreneur. She had been stripped of her tools and her agency and turned into an employee. She was no longer there to create the product, she was there to decorate the environment in which it was sold. This was the era of the barmaid, and it marked the final stage of the erasure of female power in the world of beer. The transition from owner to ornament was a deliberate strategy of the new industrial breweries. As brewing moved into massive factories owned by men, the social space of the alehouse had to be redefined. The old cottage alehouse was seen as too domestic, too female, and too independent. The new commercial taverns and gin palaces were designed to be masculine spaces, but they needed a female presence to soften the environment and attract customers. The barmaid was the perfect solution. She was hired for her youth, her appearance, and her ability to manage the moods of men. She was a professional server, but she was legally and financially powerless. She did not own the beer she poured, and she had no say in how it was made. She was a worker in a system that had once belonged to her ancestors. This shift in status is captured perfectly in the folk songs and popular culture of the time. In the medieval era, songs about alewives often focused on their skill, their wealth, or their sharp tongues. There was a sense of respect and even a little fear for the woman who held the brewing paddle. But the songs of the 18th and 19th centuries tell a different story. The barmaid is portrayed as a figure of mockery or a target of sexual desire. She is the pretty Phyllis, or the saucy Sue. She is described as a flirtatious distraction, a woman whose value is tied entirely to how well she can please her male patrons. The respect for the craftswoman had been replaced by the objectification of the worker. The working conditions for these women were brutal. Unlike the alewife who managed her own time and worked within her own home, the barmaid was at the mercy of the landlord. She worked 18-hour days in smoke-filled rooms, surrounded by noise and frequently facing harassment. She was often required to dress in a way that emphasized her appearance, further reinforcing the idea that she was part of the furniture. If she grew old or lost her looks, she was easily replaced. There was no security, no inheritance, and no career path. The deep technical knowledge of fermentation and malting, which had been passed down through generations of women, was now seen as irrelevant to her role. She was told that she did not need to understand beer, she only needed to serve it with a smile. The law also moved to cement this new hierarchy. In many jurisdictions, new licensing laws were passed that made it nearly impossible for a single woman to hold a liquor license. The state argued that for the sake of public morality, a public house must be managed by a man. If a woman wanted to be involved in the trade, she had to be the wife or the daughter of the licensee. This effectively turned the woman into a silent partner or a subordinate. Even the few women who managed to run successful taverns found themselves under constant police surveillance. They were accused of running disorderly houses if they allowed other independent women to gather there. The social network of female support that had defined the medieval alehouse was being systematically dismantled by the police and the courts. The industrialization of beer also changed the way women interacted with the drink itself. In the era of the Brewster beer, was a food item a source of nutrition for the whole family. But in the era of the commercial tavern, beer was marketed as a masculine reward for labor. Women were increasingly discouraged from drinking in public. The rise of the temperance movement in the 19th century often targeted women, specifically claiming that a woman who drank was a threat to the family and the nation. This created a bizarre paradox. While women were being hired to serve beer in ever larger numbers, they were being socially shamed for consuming it. They were the gatekeepers of a product they were no longer supposed to enjoy. By the height of the Victorian era, the erasure was so complete that the memory of the Brewster had been buried under layers of folklore and propaganda. People looked at the barmaid behind the brass taps and assumed that women had always been the servants of the industry. They saw the illustrations of witches on beer labels and thought it was a charming old story rather than the records of a historical crime. The industrial brewers had successfully rewritten history. They had taken a female craft and turned it into a male industry, and they had taken the female master and turned her into a service worker. The barmaid was a shadow of the brewster. She possessed the same resilience and the same social intelligence, but she lacked the one thing that had made the alewife powerful ownership. Without the cauldron and without the hearth, she was at the mercy of the market. The transition from the business of brewing to the business of serving was the final victory of the patriarchal state. The woman had been removed from the fire and placed behind the bar, and in that move, the soul of the craft was lost. As we look at the history of the 19th century, we see a world where beer is big business, where the brands are male, and where the woman is just a face in the crowd. But even in this era of total exclusion, the legacy of the brewster was waiting in the shadows. The truth was hidden in the old recipes and the dusty court rolls, waiting for a new generation to rediscover the fact that the history of beer is a history of women. To understand the era of the barmaid, we must look at the physical architecture of the tavern itself. In the medieval alehouse, the brewster moved freely between her guests. There were no barriers because the space was her home. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, the introduction of the counter or the bar changed everything. The bar was not just a piece of furniture, it was a legal and social wall. It was designed to keep the female server in a designated area and the male customer in another. It effectively turned the workspace into a cage. For the first time in history, the woman was physically separated from the product she served. She no longer held the keys to the cellar or the recipe to the brew. She stood behind the mahogany barrier as a prisoner of the system that had stolen her craft. This period also saw the emergence of a new and devastating smear campaign during the gin craze of the mid-18th century. While beer was being professionalized as a healthy and masculine drink, gin was marketed as a female vice. The authorities and moralists created the caricature of Mother Gin or Madame Genet. They claimed that gin was the ruin of mothers, leading to the neglect of children and the collapse of the family. The famous engravings by William Hogarth Beer Street and Gin Lane tell the story perfectly. In Beer Street, everything is orderly and male. In Gin Lane, a woman is depicted in a state of decay, her child falling from her arms. This was the final blow to the reputation of the independent woman in the alcohol trade. By linking women with the destructive nature of gin, the state could justify further stripping away the rights of female bar owners and barmaids. The barmaid was also a victim of a new kind of social surveillance. In the 19th century, the presence of a woman behind a bar was seen as a moral problem that required constant debate in Parliament. Anti-barmaid movements were formed, claiming that the profession was a gateway to immorality. These reformers did not want to save the women, they wanted to remove them from the public eye. They argued that a woman who spent her day in a tavern was losing her femininity. They were trying to force women back into the private domestic sphere, where their labor had no commercial value. The barmaid stood her ground, but she was fighting a war on two fronts: the sexual harassment from her patrons and the moral judgment from the state. Furthermore, the industrial brewers began to use the barmaid as a marketing tool in a way that the brewster could never have imagined. They used her image on posters and in advertisements to sell a product that she had no hand in making. She became the face of the industry, but she was a face without a voice. The technical skills of malting and fermentation, which had once been the pride of the brewster, were now replaced by the performance of service. A barmaid's success was measured by how many pints she could pull and how many regulars she could keep happy, not by the quality of the brew itself. The mastery of the cauldron had been replaced by the mastery of the tap. This was the final stage of the structural erasure. By turning the woman into a server behind a barrier, the industry had effectively neutralized the threat of female independence. The barmaid was visible, but she was powerless. She was part of the history of beer, but she was no longer allowed to write it. The legacy of the Brewster was buried under the mahogany of the bar and the propaganda of the gin craze. The fire had been moved from the hearth to the industrial boiler, and the woman who had once stood by that fire was now just a worker in the shadows of a male empire. History is written by those who hold the pen, but folklore is the memory of those who lived the story. While the legal records and the industrial breweries successfully erased the alewife from the official history of business, they could not scrub her from the collective imagination of the people. Instead, she was transformed. She was camouflaged. She was hidden in the very stories we tell our children. Every time we see the classic silhouette of a witch on a Halloween card or hear a nursery rhyme about an old woman in a cottage, we are looking at the distorted fragments of the Brewster's legacy. Folklore became the accidental archive of a suppressed profession. Consider the iconic figure of Mother Goose. She is usually depicted as an elderly woman wearing a tall, pointed black hat, often with a broomstick, and sometimes accompanied by a goose or a cat. This is not a coincidence. Mother Goose is a direct visual descendant of the medieval alewife. The tall hat, which we now associate with magic, was once the professional crown of the market brewster. The goose, or the cat, was her protector of grain. The stories she tells are the echoes of the wisdom and the community news that were once shared around the alewife's hearth. By turning her into a harmless storyteller of fairy tales, society found a way to keep her image while stripping away her economic power. We also find the Brewster hidden in the nonsense of nursery rhymes. Take, for example, the story of Old Mother Hubbard, who went to her cupboard to get her poor dog a bone. In the early versions of these oral traditions, many historians believe these characters represented the independent women who managed their own household inventories. The cupboard was not just a pantry, it was the storeroom of a business. When the poem says the cupboard was bare, it reflects the economic hardship of the independent female trader during the era of the guilds and the grain taxes. These rhymes were often coded social commentaries disguised as children entertainment, allowing the memory of the independent woman to survive the censors of the church and the state. The very architecture of the fairy tale witch cottage is a distorted memory of the Brewster's home. In stories like Hansel and Gretel, we see an old woman living alone in the woods with a massive oven or a bubbling cauldron. To a modern child, this is a house of horror. But to a medieval peasant, this was a place of business. The oven was for malting grain, and the cauldron was for brewing ale. The forest setting reflects the reality of the later Middle Ages, when independent women were pushed out of the cities and forced to operate on the margins of society. The fear that these stories instill in us, the idea that a woman living alone with a boiling pot is dangerous, is the successful outcome of centuries of propaganda. We have been trained to fear the very woman who once provided the community with its most basic nutrition. Even the concept of the wise woman or the village healer is inextricably linked to the alewife. As we have seen, the Brewster was a master of herbs and groot. She knew which plants could heal and which could preserve. In folklore, this knowledge was rebranded as magic. The herbalist became the potion maker. The skilled brewer became the sorceress. By framing her technical expertise as something supernatural, the industry could claim that her success was not due to hard work and intelligence, but to a pact with the devil. This allowed the male-dominated scientific and medical professions to seize her knowledge while demonizing her person. Today, we see the legacy of the alewife in the branding of modern craft beer. Many breweries use images of witches, cauldrons, and broomsticks on their labels, often without realizing the tragic history behind those symbols. They are using the imagery of the victim to sell the product of the industry that destroyed her. It is a final bitter irony of history. But as we begin to peel back the layers of folklore, we see that the witch was never a monster. She was a mother, a widow, a neighbor, and an entrepreneur. She was a woman who mastered the biology of grain and the chemistry of fire. The survival of these symbols in our folklore is a testament to the power of the alewife. They could take her land, her tools, and her life, but they could not take her image from the heart of the people. She remains a haunting presence in our culture, a reminder of a time when the hearth was a place of power and the woman was the master of the brew. When we look at Mother Goose or the silhouette of a witch against a full moon, we are not looking at a myth. We are looking at a distorted photograph of our own lost history. The Brewster is still there, waiting for us to look past the pointed hat and the bubbling cauldron to see the brilliant businesswoman who stood behind them. The term old wives' tales is perhaps one of the most successful linguistic erasures in history. Today we use it to describe a superstition or a foolish belief with no basis in science. But in the medieval world, an old wife was an authority. She was a Brewster, a healer, and a keeper of the community's oral history. When she spoke about the properties of herbs or the timing of the moon, it was based on centuries of empirical observation by women who had mastered the art of fermentation. By rebranding this collective wisdom as nonsense, the emerging male-dominated scientific community effectively silenced the female voice. They turned a professional lecture into a fairy tale and a master of the craft into a senile storyteller. Every time we dismiss a piece of ancient advice as an old wives' tale, we are unknowingly participating in the final stage of the alewife's silencing. We also see the alewife's legacy in the very names of the pubs that replaced her. In the early days, a public house was often known simply by the name of the woman who ran it. But as the industrial brewers took over, the names were changed to reflect the new male power structures. We see thousands of pubs named the King's Head, the Royal Oak, or the Brewer's Arms. The woman who built the foundation of the trade was removed from the sign and moved to the kitchen or the basement. Her identity was replaced by symbols of the state and the church. Even the word tavern itself is derived from the Latin for a wooden hut, or shed a deliberate attempt to distance the professional male establishment from the domestic female cottage. The pub sign became a marker of the new owner's territory, a flag planted on the ruins of the Brewster's empire. Perhaps the most haunting survival of the alewife is the myth of the cauldron that never runs dry. In folklore across Europe, we hear stories of magical pots that can feed an entire village or brew a potion of eternal life. This is a direct memory of the Brewster's mastery of the supply chain. During times of famine or plague, the woman with the cauldron was the one who kept the village alive with her nutritious ale. She was the one who knew how to stretch a small amount of grain into a gallon of liquid bread. The magic was not in a spell. It was in her skill as a manager and a chemist. When we tell stories of magical cauldrons today, we are unknowingly celebrating the economic genius of the medieval women who were eventually hunted as witches for the very talents that saved their neighbors. Finally, we must look at the evolution of the hag archetype. The medieval Brewster was often a physically strong, capable woman who spent her days lifting heavy vats and stirring thick mashes. But as the propaganda took hold, she was reimagined in folklore as a frail, crooked, and terrifying hag. This transformation served a vital purpose. It made the independent woman look weak and repulsive. It told the young women of the village that if they chose the path of independence, they would end up alone and feared. The folklore was a warning. It took the powerful figure of the alewife and turned her into a ghost story used to frighten children into obedience. The Brewster did not vanish. She was simply rewritten until she was unrecognizable even to herself. The fire that was extinguished on the medieval hearth did not stay cold forever. For centuries, the history of beer was told as a story of men of industrial barons and corporate giants. But in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a quiet revolution began to stir. Women all over the world started to look back at the dusty court rolls and the distorted folklore, and they recognized themselves. They saw that the cauldron did not belong to the witch, it belonged to the Brewster. They realized that the history of beer was their birthright, and they began the long and difficult process of reclaiming the flame. This is the era of the modern resurrection, and it is the final chapter in the story of the alewife. The rise of the craft beer movement was the catalyst for this return. As the world grew tired of standardized industrial lagers, people began to crave flavor, character, and community. This was exactly what the medieval alewife had provided. The small-scale independent brewery is the modern descendant of the cottage hearth. And in these breweries, women are once again taking their place as masters of the craft. Today, there are thousands of female head brewers, lab technicians, and brewery owners who are proving that the technical skill of fermentation is not a male domain, but a human one. They are using their knowledge of chemistry and biology to innovate in ways that would have made their ancestors proud. Organizations like the Pink Boot Society have emerged to provide the support and the networks that were once stolen by the male guilds. These women are sharing market intelligence, they are mentoring the next generation, and they are fighting for equal pay and representation in the industry. They are breaking the mahogany barriers of the bar and the glass ceilings of the corporate boardrooms. When a woman stands by a modern stainless steel vat today, she is not just making a drink, she is performing an act of historical reclamation. She is stirring the same spirit that Alice and Marjorie held in the face of the witchfinders. We are also seeing a reclaiming of the symbols themselves. Modern female brewers are no longer running away from the image of the witch, they are embracing it and redefining it. They understand that the pointed hat and the cauldron were symbols of professional authority. By using these images in their branding, they are telling the truth of their history. They are transforming the caricature of the hag back into the portrait of the expert. They are showing the world that the magic of the brew is not a pact with the devil, but a mastery of nature. The Brewster is no longer a ghost in the folklore, she is a leader in the economy. But the work is not yet finished. The legacy of the smear campaign still lingers in the way beer is marketed and consumed. We still face the stereotypes of the barmaid and the assumption that women prefer sweet or light drinks. To truly honor the alewife, we must continue to peel back the layers of propaganda. We must recognize that every time a woman orders a pint or brews a batch, she is part of a tradition that stretches back thousands of years. We must tell the stories of the Brewsters not as victims of the witch trials, but as pioneers of capitalism and masters of science. As we conclude this 24,000-word journey, we must look at the glass in our hand with new eyes. That liquid bread is the result of 1,000 years of female labor. It is a product born of the hearth sustained by the Brewster and defended through the fires of the stake. The story of the alewife is a reminder that history can be stolen, but it can also be found. It is a story of resilience, of intelligence, and of the unbreakable link between women and the craft of creation. The alewife has returned. She is no longer hiding in the nursery rhymes or the shadows of the pub signs. She is in the laboratories, she is in the tap rooms, and she is at the head of the industry. The cauldron is boiling once again, and the brew is stronger than ever. We have reclaimed the hearth, we have reclaimed the flame, and finally, we have reclaimed the truth. The era of the Brewster is not a thing of the past, it is the future. And as we raise a glass to the women who came before us, we know that the fire they started will never be put out again.